It was a cold afternoon in December, quiet like any other in the suburban neighborhood of Spring, Texas. Rows of single-family homes lined the street, yards trimmed, driveways clean, wind chimes gently swaying under a pale winter sky. Nothing about this place suggested violence. Nothing about this home hinted at the chaos that was about to erupt in its front yard. But just before 6 p.m. on December 6, 2021, a woman stood outside her home holding her phone, camera recording, facing a man she had spent 2 decades of her life with. In less than 60 seconds, her life would be over. The video, later retrieved from her device, begins without warning. There's no screaming, no visible struggle, just a calm but tense confrontation between two people who once promised each other everything. Then came the line, "Okay, goodbye, you're gonna go see Jesus." The words, spoken in a low, almost monotone voice, would go on to haunt a courtroom, divide a family, and fracture a community. In the video, the camera angle shifts slightly before a hand enters the frame, holding a firearm. 3 rapid gunshots break the silence. The video ends in static and stillness. At that moment, 48-year-old Patricia Birmingham collapsed onto the pavement of her own driveway. Her husband, Carrie Birmingham, stood just feet away, not attempting to flee, not attempting to help. According to eyewitness accounts, he remained there silently, motionless, as if frozen in place by what he had just done. When police arrived minutes later, Patricia was already dead. Carrie made no attempt to escape. He was arrested on site without resistance. For law enforcement, it was one of the rare cases where the how was caught on tape. But the why, the question that would haunt prosecutors, investigators, and especially the couple's daughter, would prove to be more elusive. The video offered clarity in one sense and deepened the mystery in another. This wasn't a chaotic fight that spiraled into an accident. It was calculated, clear, and final. And it all happened under the watch of a lens Patricia chose to activate in what would become the final act of her life. The community response was immediate and visceral. Neighbors who had known the Birminghams for years described them as quiet, private, just another married couple. No police reports, no history of domestic disturbances, no signs that anything was wrong, at least not from the outside. But the camera doesn't lie. And what it revealed was far from ordinary. The video was not leaked to the public, but was shown in its entirety during court proceedings, and it left the jury visibly shaken. It wasn't just the violence, it was the eerie stillness that surrounded it. The deliberate way Carrie raised the weapon, the detached tone in his voice, the absence of any attempt to de-escalate, to pause, to choose something, anything else. Patricia Birmingham wasn't a stranger to fear. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had begun recording more frequently, sometimes capturing arguments, sometimes only silence. The phone had become her only witness, perhaps her only defense. Some would later speculate she knew something was coming. Others believed she simply didn't trust her words would be enough if things ever went wrong. So she documented. She archived her own ending without knowing how final it would be. The footage raised more than just legal questions. It became the centerpiece of a discussion around emotional escalation, marital breakdown, and the point at which fear turns into foresight. Investigators would soon comb through the history of the Birmingham household, looking for red flags, missed signals, anything that could explain how a marriage ended with a firearm in daylight. But this wasn't a typical domestic homicide. There were no frantic 911 calls before the incident, no bloodied furniture, no trail of bruises stretching back years. In fact, there was no history of physical abuse at all, only what experts would later describe as psychological erosion, control without contact, silence as a weapon, words withheld until one final sentence followed by 3 deafening shots. The case file was opened, the evidence was clear, and yet the conclusion was anything but simple. A seemingly stable man had taken the life of his wife without hesitation, in front of a recording device, and did nothing to conceal it. It was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was a fracture, slow, invisible, and fatal. As police secured the crime scene, collected Patricia's phone, and escorted Carrie away in handcuffs, their daughter Olivia was left standing in the yard, barefoot, shaking, crying, watching the only 2 people she had ever trusted disappear in a matter of minutes, one to death, one to custody. The investigation would now need to answer not only what happened, but how a man like Carrie Birmingham, by all accounts rational, educated, and calm, could cross that final line with such terrifying clarity. The footage spoke for itself. Now the case would begin to speak through forensics, interviews, and the slow, painful process of understanding a tragedy that had already concluded with a gunshot. but had truly started long before the camera was ever turned on. After the shooting, investigators shifted focus from the crime scene to the victim's life. They weren't just looking for motive, they were searching for context. And in the case of 48-year-old Patricia Birmingham, context came not in the form of bruises or police reports, but through careful documentation she had quietly left behind. Patricia lived a life of order. She worked in administrative support, kept a low profile, and maintained what many described as a calm and polite demeanor. Friends, neighbors, even co-workers never saw signs of turmoil. But within the digital logs of her personal phone, a different narrative surfaced, one defined not by overt confrontation, but by growing emotional distance and quiet apprehension. Weeks before the incident, Patricia had begun recording interactions at home. Not dramatic, not even hostile, just conversations, or silence with tension so thick it felt recorded out of necessity. She didn't label these recordings, didn't share them widely, but their existence indicated a heightened awareness. It was as if she had begun building a record, not of abuse, but of erosion. Messages retrieved from her device revealed subtle distress. In one to a close colleague, she wrote, "I feel like I have to rehearse every sentence at home. There's a weight in the air that never goes away." Another message described her sleep as fragmented. She didn't mention threats or physical harm, only a growing sense of imbalance, of not feeling safe enough to relax. Forensic investigators would later confirm the pattern. Patricia had used her phone to record not only the final encounter, but several prior moments at home, including long stretches of silence where only breathing and footsteps could be heard. There were no arguments, no yelling, only stillness. In one audio clip, she whispered into the mic, "This is just in case." This wasn't impulsive. It was precautionary, and in hindsight, prophetic. There were no signs in the house of physical violence, no broken furniture, no smashed items. Yet the recordings told a different kind of story, one in which emotional detachment and control were just as oppressive as any visible injury. A psychological slow burn that had never exploded until it did. In examining her personal life, investigators didn't find direct evidence of an affair, though suspicions had existed. But even if romantic betrayal had been a factor, it didn't explain why Patricia had taken to quietly recording her environment. She wasn't preparing to expose someone. She was bracing herself for what she feared might come. A forensic psychologist consulted during the case noted that Patricia exhibited what they call anticipatory behavior, a form of risk response often seen in victims of emotional domination. It's not based on a single event, but an accumulation of tension that becomes impossible to ignore. "You can't always explain it," the psychologist said. "You just know something is coming and you prepare." For law enforcement, this presented a challenge. There were no prior reports, no official complaints. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. But within those recordings, Patricia's behavior built a quiet case, not against a crime that had already happened, but against the feeling that one day it might. Her documentation became key evidence, not just for its content, but for what it revealed about her mental state. It showed a woman trying to stay rational while her personal space tightened around her. It showed preparation in the absence of support. And it showed that she had, perhaps subconsciously, accepted that no one else was going to intervene. What makes this case especially disturbing is that Patricia's final act, turning on her phone's camera, wasn't out of fear that no one would believe what happened. It was fear that no one would believe what led up to it. The final video wasn't isolated. It was the end of a silent timeline, a culmination of the unspoken. From a distance, Carrie Birmingham did not appear to be a man capable of violence. Age 60 at the time of the incident, he carried the demeanor of someone long settled into the routine of life. He was neither charismatic nor aggressive. He was the kind of neighbor people would describe as quiet, polite, occasionally seen watering the lawn or taking out the trash, someone who gave no reason for concern. But in cases like these, appearances are often the most deceptive layer. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began building a profile not just of the victim, but of the man she had lived with for over 2 decades. Carrie had no prior criminal record, no known issues with substance abuse, no reports of violent behavior, either in the home or outside of it. By most standards, he lived a low-profile life. But when investigators spoke with those who knew the couple, a recurring theme began to emerge. Carrie had grown distant, detached, and increasingly rigid in the final year of the marriage. He had once worked in technical maintenance but had been out of stable employment for several years. Interviews with former co-workers suggested a man who was competent, methodical, but struggled with change. When the company he worked for restructured, Carrie's position was eliminated. According to one former colleague, he didn't take it well. He felt replaced. Losing his job didn't immediately destabilize his life, but it marked the beginning of a slow withdrawal from social connection. He became more isolated, less engaged with neighbors, and, according to Patricia's close friends, more controlling at home, not in overt ways. There were no demands or threats, but decisions that had once been shared, household expenses, schedules, even who they spent time with, became more unilateral. One neighbor recalled a subtle change in how Carrie carried himself. He wasn't aggressive, but he stopped saying hello. He started watching more than talking. You could feel it. It wasn't behavior that would warrant a call to the police, but it was enough to make people notice. When investigators obtained Carrie's emails and browser history, they found signs of psychological strain. Several bookmarked articles focused on relationship betrayal, emotional manipulation, and how to identify dishonesty in a spouse. While these alone didn't suggest criminal intent, they did point to a mind increasingly preoccupied with suspicion. Patricia's behavior, her late nights at work, her increased privacy, may have fed into those suspicions, whether grounded or not. The detectives consulted a behavioral analyst to examine Carrie's trajectory. What emerged was a pattern of what professionals call passive internalization, a person who experiences loss or perceived failure but doesn't outwardly express it. Instead, resentment accumulates silently, unchecked and unresolved. Over time, the internal world becomes detached from the external one. To outsiders, the person seems calm. Inside, tension builds. What complicated matters was Carrie's lack of any documented outbursts. There were no recorded arguments, no neighbors who had ever heard yelling from the home. From a law enforcement standpoint, this made the case harder to contextualize. There were no prior incidents to suggest a buildup to homicide, but the absence of noise didn't mean the absence of escalation. Forensic psychologists involved in the case described Carrie's progression as emotional compression. Over time, he had quietly restructured his life around a perceived loss of control over his career, his marriage, and eventually his sense of identity. This kind of slow-motion unraveling is rare, but not unheard of. In many domestic homicide cases, there are two types of perpetrators: those who explode outwardly and those who collapse inwardly until they break. Detectives also examined his interactions with Patricia in public. Friends of the couple mentioned that Carrie often deferred to her in conversation, but would later question those moments in private, suggesting he felt dismissed or unimportant. He wasn't confrontational, but he carried grievances quietly. When questioned, several acquaintances used the same phrase to describe him. He seemed tired, not physically, not from work, but tired in a deeper, less visible way, the kind of exhaustion that comes from feeling unseen, irrelevant, or outpaced by change. This wasn't an excuse, nor was it a justification, but from an investigative perspective, it helped build a psychological profile that made sense of the sudden violence. Carrie was not a man with a violent history, but he was a man whose inner world had been shrinking for years, and no one had noticed until it collapsed completely. It's important to recognize the nuance in these profiles. Not every person under strain becomes a danger to others. Most people carry emotional burdens without ever causing harm, but in this case, the convergence of personal loss, emotional disconnection, and internalized resentment created a dangerous equation, one that Patricia may have sensed but not fully understood. December 6, 2021, began like most Mondays in Spring, Texas, uneventful, cool, and quiet. The kind of winter morning that passed unnoticed. For Patricia Birmingham, it was a routine day. Check emails, prepare breakfast, and organize her work-from-home files. For those closest to her, nothing about her mood or behavior signaled urgency or fear. But beneath that calm exterior, a decision had already been made. She was going to record everything. By mid-morning, Patricia was seated at the kitchen table, phone within reach. Investigators later noted that the device had over 3 hours of recent audio logs saved, none dramatic, but each one intentional. Background noise, idle conversations, silent gaps. What stood out to forensic audio analysts wasn't what was said, it was the atmosphere, the tension in the silence, the measured cadence in her voice when she did speak. She had grown accustomed to documenting the ordinary, anticipating that one day it wouldn't be. Around 1 p.m., Patricia placed a grocery delivery order. Surveillance from her front door camera confirmed the handoff shortly after 2:15. Nothing unusual. No signs of distress. She signed the receipt, exchanged a brief smile with the driver, and returned inside. At 3:27 p.m., an argument began. That much was certain. A neighbor across the street later reported hearing muffled voices, raised, but not yelling. The front door was closed, curtains drawn. What occurred inside during the next 30 minutes remains partially unknown, though a portion of the exchange was caught on Patricia's phone, which had been placed discreetly near the front hallway. Audio investigators later enhanced the recording. It captured two distinct voices, one male, one female. No slamming doors, no threats, just increasingly terse dialogue. There was a pause, then footsteps, then silence. What followed occurred in the driveway. At 4:03 p.m., Patricia opened the front door. She stepped outside holding her phone in front of her. The camera was already recording. Her expression was unreadable, flat, focused, but not panicked. She stood just a few feet from the garage, positioned with the lens angled slightly upward. According to the timestamp, it took only 27 seconds from the start of that final video to the first shot. The footage was reviewed in a controlled setting by the lead investigators. The framing was off-center, but clear enough to confirm the sequence. Patricia, standing alone. A male voice off-camera. A brief verbal exchange, then 3 quick gunshots. The screen trembled as the phone dropped. A thud followed, then silence. What struck detectives was not only the cold efficiency of the act, but the way the event unfolded without visible chaos. No screaming, no attempt to flee, no pleas. It was a sequence of action that had the marks of emotional resignation, not resistance, the kind of moment that felt less like a confrontation and more like a closing act. Immediately following the incident, 911 was called by a young voice, shaking, crying, barely coherent. It was Olivia, the couple's daughter. She had been inside the home during the argument and witnessed the aftermath. First responders arrived within minutes. The scene was secure. The suspect remained on site, unarmed, waiting on the steps. EMS pronounced Patricia dead at the scene. Cause of death, gunshot wounds to the chest and upper abdomen. No attempt had been made to administer aid. The weapon was recovered without incident. Ballistics confirmed a close-range discharge. The gun was registered to the household and had not been modified. Investigators later learned it had been stored in an upstairs drawer, not locked, but concealed. A warrant was executed on the home that evening. In Patricia's email drafts folder, they found a message, never sent, dated 3 days before her death. It read, "I'm tired of feeling watched. I can't be myself here anymore. No threats, no direct accusations." But the language was clear. She felt trapped. The day that ended her life was not a storm of rage. It was the collision point of years of quiet pressure. The emotional gravity had been building too long, too invisibly. And while the court would later determine the legality of that final act, the psychological trajectory leading there was already undeniable. The final hours of Patricia's life didn't reflect panic or chaos. They reflected something far more chilling. Acceptance. She had known to press record, she had known the risk, and yet she walked outside anyway. The sun had just begun to set when Harris County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene. Within minutes, the quiet street in Spring, Texas, transformed into an active crime zone. Yellow tape stretched across the driveway, flashing lights bathed the brick facade of the house in red and blue, and neighbors gathered silently behind fences and mailboxes, straining to understand what had happened just steps away from their own front doors. First responders moved quickly and clinically. Patricia Birmingham's body lay near the front of the garage, partially turned to one side. No movement, no pulse. The wounds were clear, the outcome unmistakable. Nearby, a cell phone, still recording until its battery died, was bagged as evidence. Officers took control of the perimeter, separated witnesses, and began their initial statements. The man believed to be responsible sat on the concrete steps of the front porch, hands visible, offering no resistance, no questions, and no explanation. The call to dispatch had come from inside the home. It was their daughter, Olivia, 17 years old. Her voice on the line was cracked, raw with shock, giving only fragments. "My mom. He shot her. Outside the house." The operator had to ask multiple times for the address. She was barely coherent. When deputies entered the house to ensure no further threats remained, they found Olivia standing in the hallway, pale, shaking, unable to speak. She was escorted out gently and taken into a cruiser for safety and support. At that point, the crime was technically resolved. A victim, a weapon, a suspect, a recording. But investigators knew better than to treat any case as simple, even those with open evidence and a suspect on site. The question now was not just what happened, but why it unfolded the way it did. What cracks had led to the collapse? What had been overlooked or ignored? What would this family's history reveal? Inside the home, the atmosphere was sterile but telling. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no blood other than what was found outside. This wasn't the aftermath of a brawl or spontaneous violence. It was something quieter, colder. Every drawer, every document, every device would now become part of the case file. Detectives began with Patricia's phone. Beyond the final video, they located several files stored to the cloud. Audio clips, notes, unsent emails. Each one offered small glimpses into her mindset. There was no mention of physical abuse, no formal complaints or police calls, but the narrative was unmistakable. A woman who felt watched, restricted, and slowly erased from her own life. Her laptop revealed more. A search history filled with questions about emotional manipulation, legal separation, and protective strategies. Investigators found a draft email to a divorce attorney dated just 4 days before her death. It was never sent. Meanwhile, the suspect was taken into custody. At the station, he offered minimal resistance. He waived his right to a lawyer in the early hours, but said little. The initial interview, recorded for the case file, was notable not for what was said, but for how little he seemed to process. There was no visible panic, no denial, just a detached acknowledgement. He confirmed his identity, confirmed that the woman was his wife, confirmed that a firearm had been discharged. But when asked why, he said only, "You'll see it in the video." Back at the crime scene, forensic units cataloged the interior of the house. The gun had been stored, unsecured, in the bedroom drawer. No locks, no safes, no evidence of forced access. A decision made, a moment acted on, with nothing in place to prevent it. One of the detectives later noted in their field report, there was no blood trail, no hesitation. It was an execution of something long contemplated, if not explicitly planned. Forensic psychologists would echo this sentiment in later evaluations. This wasn't a crime of sudden rage, it was a slow collapse, ending in an irreversible act that may have been building for months, maybe longer. Interviews continued throughout the night. Neighbors, co-workers, extended family, most expressed shock. None had suspected imminent violence. Some mentioned Carrie's recent isolation. Others recalled Patricia's increasing distance, but none had seen enough to act. And that is often how it happens. At the center of the scene was Olivia, her presence, her grief, her witness to the fallout. For law enforcement, the priority was both criminal investigation and crisis response. Child services, trauma counselors, and legal advocates were brought in. She was not only a witness, she was a secondary victim, a daughter who had lost both parents in a single moment, one to death, one to a decision that could never be undone. By sunrise, the formal arrest had been processed. Charges were filed. The medical examiner released the official cause of death. The evidence, digital, physical, psychological, was strong. The case would go to trial, but no file, no report, no court ruling would repair what had already been destroyed. For investigators, this case wasn't about solving a mystery. It was about documenting a descent. It was about showing how absence of communication, of support, of intervention can lead to irreversible consequences. A murder had occurred. But long before the shots were fired, there had been a kind of slow suffocation. And in the wake of it, a home stood silent, emptied not by noise, but by what no one had said. The trial of Carrie Birmingham began more than 2 years after the shooting. Delays caused by procedural motions, evidence authentication, and psychological evaluations had pushed the timeline. But the weight of the case never lifted from the community. Spring, Texas, had not forgotten. Neither had the investigators, the prosecutors, or most of all, Patricia's daughter. The courtroom was deliberately modest. A standard district court setting, wooden benches, a raised judge's platform, flags flanking the state seal. But inside that space, something heavier moved. The unresolved grief of a family shattered, and the tension of a case that, while seemingly clear-cut, carried psychological and legal complications that demanded attention. The prosecution opened with confidence. Their case centered on the video, recorded by Patricia herself, combined with forensic evidence, witness statements, and the defendant's own admission during initial questioning. This was not a whodunit. It was a question of why and how justice should be measured in the face of recorded reality. The jury was comprised of 12 individuals, 9 women, 3 men, selected after extensive vetting. The defense had not contested the content of the video. What they argued instead was mental state, an emotional spiral, years in the making, culminating in a tragic but unpremeditated act. They didn't dispute the shooting. They challenged the motive. The prosecution presented the timeline of events with precision. They replayed the video, carefully edited to stop at the moment before the fatal shots, to protect the jury from unnecessary trauma. They showed the messages Patricia had written, the unsent email to a divorce lawyer, and her search history indicating fear, confusion, and the feeling of being psychologically cornered. A forensic psychologist called by the prosecution described Patricia's behavior as preparatory but not paranoid. She wasn't reacting to violence, she was responding to the gradual erosion of emotional safety. The jury listened in silence. Key testimony came from Olivia. Her statement wasn't dramatic. It was steady, focused. She described the change in her home over the last year, how her mother had become quieter, how her father had grown cold, how the house no longer felt like home. She recalled the moment after the shots, how she stood frozen, unable to move, until she realized she had to call 911. Her voice didn't break. It hardened. She had in many ways aged years since that December afternoon. The defense, for its part, focused on the emotional deterioration of Carrie Birmingham. They introduced expert testimony suggesting depressive withdrawal, loss of identity, and a spiraling sense of abandonment. They emphasized his lack of criminal history, his quiet compliance with police, and his apparent remorse after the act. This was not a planned killing, one of the defense attorneys stated. It was the collapse of a man who had no outlet, no help, no idea how to navigate the changes in his life. But the prosecution did not relent. They highlighted that intent doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes, they argued, it looks like silence, like standing on a porch with a gun, like speaking one final sentence, "You're going to go see Jesus," before pulling the trigger. Throughout the trial, Patricia's recordings were central. They painted a portrait of a home that had grown hollow, of a woman who had begun documenting her reality not because anyone told her to, but because no one was listening. In closing arguments, the state was direct. Patricia Birmingham did everything she could to avoid this outcome. She tried to leave quietly. She gathered evidence. She never retaliated. She never threatened. She just wanted to feel safe. And when she couldn't, she prepared. This wasn't self-defense. This was an execution in the emotional vacuum of a dying marriage. The jury deliberated for several hours. Their verdict: guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The reasoning, according to court records and post-verdict interviews, hinged on the mental health defense. The jury found that while the act was intentional, it lacked full premeditation. The sentence, 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. To some, it felt like justice. To others, like a failure of the system to recognize the full weight of a documented crime. For Olivia, it was neither closure nor relief. "I lost my mom that day," she told the court during victim impact statements, "and the man who did it took everything from me. I still have to live with what I saw and with the silence that came before it." By the time the courtroom emptied and the final sentence was handed down, the headlines had begun to fade. For the public, the case of Patricia Birmingham's death was a tragedy resolved by law. A man convicted, a woman remembered, a community left unsettled. But for those closest to it, especially the daughter who had survived the silence of that home, the ending in court was not closure. It was only the beginning of a quieter kind of devastation. Olivia Birmingham was 17 when she witnessed the aftermath of her mother's death. Not through news clips or police reports, but from the other side of a thin wall, just feet from where it happened. She wasn't in the video, she wasn't in the courtroom most days, but she was in every breath of this case, whether she chose to be or not. After the shooting, Olivia was placed under temporary guardianship with extended family. Counselors, social workers, and legal advocates were involved from the beginning, recognizing the complexity of her trauma. Not only had she lost her mother, she now had to confront the reality that her father, once her primary protector, was behind the act that destroyed their family. The duality of grief and betrayal became her new normal. In her victim impact statement, she chose her words carefully. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She said, "The world saw what happened to my mom. I saw what it did to both of us. I lost her that day, but I also lost who I was supposed to be. I don't know how to be a daughter anymore, and I don't know if I'll ever want to be a parent myself. Statements like that are not just emotional expressions, they're evidence, proof of long-term layered harm. And Olivia's experience became a critical point of discussion in legal and psychological circles in the months following the trial. She had become what professionals call a secondary victim, someone not physically harmed, yet permanently altered by proximity to violence. The mental health impact of domestic homicides on children is well documented but often overlooked in courtroom discourse. In this case, Olivia was a unique figure, old enough to understand everything, young enough to be shaped by it. Therapists working with her reported symptoms of complicated grief, where mourning is tangled with confusion, guilt, and internalized blame. It wasn't just that she lost her mother, it was that she had no safe place left to store the memory of either parent. Investigators, in reviewing the full arc of the case, returned often to the subtle signs that hindsight made obvious. Patricia's recordings, her emails, even the fact that she began sleeping with her door closed and locked. None of these were criminal red flags on their own. Together they formed a pattern, one that law enforcement is only just beginning to recognize more broadly: psychological entrapment without physical violence. A condition in which a victim's intuition is their only weapon, and society's tools are still not built to respond in time. This case also reignited policy conversations in Texas courts about how emotional abuse and coercive control are considered in legal proceedings. While physical abuse often leaves visible evidence, emotional abuse does not. It leaves behaviors, feelings, withdrawal, confusion, and in many cases recordings like Patricia's. But even with data, even with a video that captured the end, the law struggled to assign weight to what led up to it. The 10-year sentence was a reflection of this tension. To the system, it was the result of a manslaughter conviction. To Olivia, it felt like a measure of how much her mother's pain had, or had not, been seen. Outside of the legal system, the Birmingham case prompted training updates within domestic violence advocacy groups. Workshops for police departments began including modules on emotional pattern recognition, non-physical red flags, and digital documentation by victims. Experts began advocating for tools that help law enforcement better evaluate psychological risk factors, even in the absence of injury. But for Olivia, these changes came too late. She did not attend follow-up panels. She declined media interviews. She asked through her legal representative for privacy. The only public statement she made was a written note issued 6 months after the verdict. "My mother did everything right. She never fought back. She never threatened. She just tried to survive." That should have been enough to keep her safe, but it wasn't. And in that note was a truth that investigators, prosecutors, and policymakers are still struggling to answer. What more can be done for those who are never hit, never chased, never bruised, but still know something isn't safe? Some cases are solved by fingerprints, others by witness testimony, timelines, or confessions. But the case of Patricia Birmingham was solved by something different: silence. Not just the silence of a quiet neighborhood or a courtroom waiting for a verdict, but the kind that builds behind closed doors, where no one screams, no one breaks furniture, and nothing looks wrong until it's far too late. What made this case unique was not the final act. It was everything that led to it. The erosion of connection, the documentation of fear, the subtle behavioral shifts that revealed piece by piece the weight of an invisible threat. Patricia never called the police. She never wrote a formal complaint, but she pressed record. And in doing so, she told a story the world could no longer ignore. Her death, though tragic, forced a wider recognition of what coercive control looks like in modern relationships. It exposed how easily psychological abuse can slip through the cracks of law, policy, and even family. It highlighted the blind spots in systems still designed to respond only after bruises appear. And perhaps most of all, it gave voice to a new kind of victim. One who isn't screaming but documenting. One who isn't broken but slowly erasing herself. One who says nothing but leaves everything behind for the rest of us to hear. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.